I still remember the way Vernon looked at me that afternoon. His voice was calm, but the warning underneath it was impossible to miss. Stay out of it. Then he pushed a stack of transfer papers across the dining room table. My sister Rowan sat beside him, staring at the documents. A pen rested near her hand. Around the table, everyone seemed relaxed, almost relieved. They acted as if the outcome had already been decided. What nobody realized was that I wasn't sitting there empty-handed. Inside my purse was information that could destroy everything they had spent months building. And while they were busy celebrating too early, my phone held a message that had arrived only hours before the meeting. A message I had been waiting weeks to receive. Looking back now, it's almost funny how confident they were. They thought this was the final step. They thought Rowan would sign, the house would change hands, and life would move on. They had no idea they were walking straight into a disaster of their own making. But to understand why that moment mattered, I need to go back almost a year. Back then, Rowan believed she had found happiness. She loved her husband, Carter Wynn. She trusted his parents. She believed she had become part of a family that cared about her. First, I believed it too. The Wynns were charming when they wanted to be. They knew exactly what to say and when to say it. Family gatherings were full of smiles, compliments, and stories that made everyone feel comfortable. Nothing seemed unusual. At least not at the beginning. The first signs were small enough to ignore. Comments about Rowan's house. Questions about the property. Suggestions disguised as casual conversation. Whenever the family gathered, somehow the discussion drifted back to the same subject. The house. It had been in our family for years. It carried memories that couldn't be replaced. Rowan had inherited it after our parents passed away, and she treated it as a connection to everything we had lost. Yet the more time passed, the more interested the Wynns became. What bothered me wasn't their curiosity. It was the persistence. They talked about the house so often that it started to feel intentional. Like they were slowly steering every conversation toward a destination only they could see. I couldn't explain why it bothered me. I only knew that something felt wrong. And that feeling would eventually lead me to uncover a secret none of us were prepared for. The moment that truly caught my attention happened several months after the wedding. Until then, I had mostly kept my concerns to myself. Nothing I had seen was serious enough to accuse anyone of wrongdoing. At worst, I thought the Wynns were overly interested in matters that didn't belong to them. Then little details started piling up. At a holiday gathering, Gail casually mentioned future renovations that could be made to the property. The strange part was that nobody had discussed renovations. Rowan certainly hadn't. Yet Gail spoke as though those decisions had already been made. A few weeks later, Vernon brought up maintenance expenses during dinner. He spoke confidently about costs, boundaries, and long-term plans. Rowan looked confused because she had never shared that information with him. I noticed it. So did a few others. But Vernon quickly changed the subject before anyone could ask questions. The incidents kept coming. Sometimes it was a comment. Sometimes it was a suggestion. Sometimes it was an oddly specific opinion about what Rowan should do next. Individually, none of it seemed important. Together, it painted a picture I couldn't ignore. What bothered me most was Rowan's reaction. At first she laughed off their advice. Then she started listening. Eventually she began questioning her own decisions. I could see the change happening little by little. Every conversation left her slightly less certain of herself. Every visit seemed to end with her seeking approval from people who had no reason to be making choices about her future. One evening we met for coffee after work. She looked exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. She admitted that she felt constantly pulled in different directions. No matter what choice she made, someone in Carter's family seemed ready to explain why another option would be better. I asked her whether she was comfortable with that. She hesitated before answering. That hesitation worried me. Because Rowan had never struggled to speak her mind before. As the weeks passed, another pattern emerged. Whenever discussions became uncomfortable, Carter rarely disagreed with his parents. He didn't openly pressure Rowan. He simply allowed the conversations to continue. That silence carried more weight than words. Then came the moment I couldn't dismiss. During a family dinner, Vernon referenced details about the property's legal paperwork. Not general information. Specific information. Information that wasn't common knowledge. The comment lasted only a few seconds, but it immediately caught my attention. Nobody else seemed to notice. I did. The question followed me all the way home that night. How had he learned something he shouldn't have known? I replayed the conversation again and again. No explanation made sense. And for the first time I stopped wondering whether something was wrong. Instead, I started wondering how deep it went. A few weeks after that dinner, I attended a birthday celebration at the Wynn family home. The evening felt ordinary. People were laughing, music played softly in the background, and conversations drifted from one topic to another. I spent most of the night moving between groups, trying to enjoy myself while keeping my growing concerns private. At one point my phone rang. The house was crowded, so I stepped away to answer the call somewhere quieter. I walked through a side hallway and headed toward the back patio. That's when I heard voices. At first I paid no attention. I assumed it was another family conversation. Then I heard Rowan's name. Without thinking I stopped. The voices belonged to Vernon, Gale, and Carter. They were speaking in low tones, believing they were alone. I couldn't hear every word clearly, but I caught enough to understand the direction of the conversation. They weren't discussing Rowan's happiness. They weren't talking about her future. They were talking about timing. About waiting for the right moment. About how certain discussions should happen gradually instead of all at once. One of them mentioned avoiding resistance. Another talked about making something feel like her own decision. The words immediately put me on edge. The conversation continued. References to paperwork surfaced. Then signatures. Then concerns about outside interference. My heart started pounding. Nobody openly stated what they were trying to accomplish, but the meaning behind their discussion felt impossible to ignore. This wasn't a family casually sharing ideas. This sounded coordinated. Carefully coordinated. I stayed where I was for only a few seconds longer. The last thing I wanted was to be discovered listening. Quietly, I stepped away and returned to the party before anyone noticed my absence. For the rest of the evening I struggled to focus on anything else. I watched them interact with Rowan. I watched the smiles. The encouragement. The friendly conversations. Everything looked perfectly normal on the surface. Yet after what I had heard, the entire room felt different. Every gesture seemed calculated. Every reassuring word sounded rehearsed. The drive home that night was worse. My mind replayed the conversation again and again. I searched for innocent explanations. Maybe I had misunderstood. Maybe I had only heard fragments and filled in the blanks myself. But no matter how many times I reconsidered it, the feeling remained. Something was happening behind Rowan's back. The problem was that feelings weren't evidence. Suspicions weren't proof. And if I was going to protect my sister, I needed facts. For the first time, I decided to stop relying on instincts. Whatever secret they were hiding, I was going to find it. The next few weeks became a routine I never expected to have. Instead of spending my evenings relaxing, I spent them searching. I started with information that anyone could legally access. Property filings, historical documents, archived notices, ownership records, and other public information connected to the house. I wasn't looking for anything specific at first. I simply wanted to understand whether there was something I had missed. Most nights ended in frustration. Pages of paperwork led nowhere. References pointed to documents that revealed nothing useful. More than once I considered giving up. Then one small detail caught my attention. It wasn't dramatic. In fact, most people would have skipped right past it. A filing referenced an earlier document connected to a decision made years before Rowan inherited the property. That document led me to another record. Then another. Piece by piece, a larger picture began forming. The deeper I went, the more inconsistencies I found. Certain statements being repeated by the Wynn family didn't match what the official records actually showed. Important details had been left out whenever they discussed the property. Facts that would have changed the entire conversation were conveniently missing. I printed copies of everything and spread them across my dining room table. 4 hours I compared dates, signatures, filings, and references. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Someone wasn't presenting the complete truth. What made it troubling wasn't that the information was hidden. It was that the omissions all pointed in the same direction. Every missing detail benefited one side. And that side wasn't Rowan's. One evening I finally sat back and stared at the stack of papers in front of me. For the first time I felt certain that my instincts had been right. There was a strategy behind everything. The pressure. The conversations. The carefully selected information. None of it was random. Yet one question continued bothering me. If the house was already valuable, why push so hard? Why spend months shaping opinions and influencing decisions? Why not simply move on if Rowan hesitated? The level of effort didn't make sense. People don't invest that much time without a reason. I began looking beyond the property itself. Instead of focusing solely on Rowan's situation, I started examining Vernon more closely. Not rumors. Not gossip. Facts. I wanted to understand what was happening on his side of the story. At first I expected nothing. But before long I stumbled across a lead I hadn't anticipated. A lead completely unrelated to the house. And the moment I saw it, I knew I was finally getting closer to the answer. Because whatever was driving Vernon, it clearly had nothing to do with family. The lead I found didn't seem important at first. In fact, I almost ignored it. It appeared in a place I wasn't expecting, connected to a matter that seemed completely separate from Rowan's situation. But the more I examined it, the harder it became to dismiss. A pattern started emerging. Not around the house. Around Vernon. His public image and his private reality were not the same thing. To most people he looked successful, confident, and in control. He carried himself like someone who always had a plan. Family members respected his opinions because he projected certainty in every conversation. What I discovered told a different story. There were signs of pressure. Not the kind people openly discuss. The kind they work desperately to keep hidden. Commitments that had not worked out as expected. Obligations that had become increasingly difficult to manage. Decisions made years earlier that were now creating consequences. Suddenly, several things began making sense. This wasn't about preserving family traditions. It wasn't about helping Rowan make smart choices. And it certainly wasn't about protecting anyone's future. The house represented something much simpler. A solution. A way out. The value attached to that property could solve problems Vernon didn't want anyone asking about. Once I understood that, his behavior looked completely different. Every suggestion. Every attempt to influence Rowan. Every effort to make her doubt herself. All of it pointed toward the same goal. The realization made me angry, but it also made me worried. Because while I was uncovering pieces of the truth, Rowan was living through the pressure every day. She wasn't seeing the larger picture. She was experiencing the emotional weight of it. Slowly, the confidence I had always admired in her began fading. She second-guessed decisions she would normally make without hesitation. She worried constantly about disappointing people. She carried responsibility that didn't belong to her. One evening she called me unexpectedly. The moment I heard her voice, I knew something was wrong. She sounded exhausted. Not from work. Not from stress. From doubt. For nearly an hour she talked through everything she had been hearing. The advice. The expectations. The guilt. Then she said something that immediately alarmed me. "Tessa, maybe I'm being selfish." I sat in silence for a moment. That sentence told me more than anything else. Because Rowan wasn't asking whether something was right. She was asking whether she deserved to protect herself. And that meant the pressure was working. By the time the call ended, I knew I was running out of time. Whatever Vernon had planned was moving closer. And if I didn't uncover the remaining pieces soon, Rowan might hand him exactly what he wanted. Everything changed 3 days later. I wasn't expecting it. Up until then, the process had moved slowly. Conversations stretched over months. Decisions were discussed repeatedly. Nothing happened quickly. Then suddenly everyone received the same news. A formal signing meeting had been scheduled. The date wasn't weeks away. It wasn't even a month away. It was only days away. The announcement immediately caught my attention. Not because a meeting existed, but because of how quickly it appeared. The people pushing for this outcome had always been careful. They preferred patience. They liked gradual progress. Yet now they were acting as though every hour mattered. That shift told me something important. There was a reason they no longer wanted delays. I just didn't know what it was. The moment I heard about the meeting, I reorganized everything. My notes. My copies of documents. Every lead I had collected over the previous months. I reviewed it all again, searching for gaps. There were still pieces missing. Enough to raise serious questions, but not enough to completely expose what was happening. And I knew that if Rowan signed before those missing pieces surfaced, questions alone wouldn't matter. I needed something stronger. The next 48 hours became a blur. I made phone calls before work, during lunch breaks, and late into the evening. Some people refused to speak. Others claimed they couldn't help. Several leads ended in dead ends. Each failure made the clock feel louder. Meanwhile, preparations for the meeting continued. Family members talked about it casually as though it were a routine event. Only I seemed to understand how much was riding on it. The night before the signing, I was sitting at my kitchen table surrounded by papers when my phone rang. The call came from someone I had contacted weeks earlier. Someone who had been difficult to reach. I answered immediately. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. By the time it ended, I wasn't looking at scattered clues anymore. I was looking at a complete picture. A connection I hadn't fully understood before suddenly became clear. The pressure campaign. The carefully shaped narrative. The urgency. The hidden motive. Everything fit together. For the first time since this started, I could see exactly what had been happening. Yet there was still one problem. Understanding the truth wasn't enough. I had to prove it. The person on the phone promised to send something important. A document. Not speculation. Not opinion. Evidence. I checked my email before going to bed. Nothing. I checked again an hour later. Still nothing. The signing meeting would begin the next morning. And I was going to walk into that room hoping the final piece arrived before it was too late. I arrived earlier than most people that morning. Part of me hoped I would receive the promised document before anyone else showed up. Part of me knew I was probably out of luck. My inbox remained empty. The meeting was being held inside a private conference room arranged by the family attorney. Everything looked professional and orderly. Chairs were positioned neatly around a large table. Folders had already been prepared. Bottles of water sat beside stacks of paperwork. The setting was designed to make everything feel official. Permanent. As relatives began arriving, I studied the room carefully. Most people seemed unaware of the tension beneath the surface. They greeted one another politely and settled into their seats. A few even joked about finally getting everything resolved. I noticed something different. Confidence. Not from everyone. From Vernon and Gail. They weren't nervous. They weren't cautious. They behaved like people who believed the outcome had already been secured. That confidence made me uneasy. Across the table, Rowan looked very different. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't upset either. She looked drained. Like someone who had spent too many months carrying a burden she never asked for. Several times she glanced toward the paperwork without touching it. Each time someone nearby offered reassurance. A reminder. An explanation. A reason why moving forward was the right choice. None of it sounded forceful. That was what made it effective. Pressure doesn't always arrive through arguments. Sometimes it arrives disguised as support. As the meeting officially began, the attorney started reviewing the documents one section at a time. People nodded. Questions were answered. Pages were turned. The process moved steadily forward. Meanwhile, I checked my phone. Nothing. I slipped it back into my pocket. A few minutes later, I checked again. Still nothing. The attorney continued speaking. My focus drifted between the discussion and the screen in front of me. Every passing minute tightened the knot in my stomach. Then Vernon looked directly at me. For a brief moment, neither of us said anything. His expression carried the same certainty I had seen all morning. The certainty of someone who believed opposition had already failed. "Stay out of it," he said quietly. A few people heard him. Most pretended not to. I didn't respond. There was no point. At least not yet. Instead, I looked back down at my phone. The screen remained unchanged. No email. No attachment. No message. Then the attorney reached the final section. The room grew noticeably quieter. A pen was placed in front of Rowan. Several eyes turned toward her. She took a slow breath. Then wrapped her fingers around it. And at that exact moment my phone vibrated. The vibration felt louder than it actually was. My eyes dropped to the screen. One new message. One attachment. After weeks of searching, sleepless nights, and unanswered questions, the final piece had arrived at the exact moment it was needed. I opened the file immediately. Within seconds I knew it was genuine. Every detail matched information I had already verified through separate sources. The missing connection I had been searching for was finally sitting in front of me. Rowan still held the pen. The attorney was waiting. The room expected her signature. Instead, I pushed back my chair and stood. Conversations stopped almost instantly. The attorney looked confused. Vernon looked annoyed. I asked Rowan to wait. Just 1 minute. That was all I needed. Before anyone could object, I walked to the table and placed several copies of documents in front of the people closest to me. Then I added the newly received file beside them. Nobody spoke at first. Pages were lifted. Eyes moved across paragraphs. Expressions slowly began to change. Confusion replaced confidence. People started comparing documents to one another. They reread sections. Check dates. Read them again. The silence became uncomfortable. I watched Vernon carefully. For the first time since arriving that morning, he looked uncertain. Not frightened. Not defeated. Just uncertain. The kind of uncertainty that appears when a situation begins moving in a direction you never expected. Questions started appearing around the table. Simple questions at first. Questions that should have had simple answers. Yet every answer seemed to create another problem. The information being reviewed didn't support the story people had been hearing. Certain assumptions suddenly looked very different. Explanations that had sounded reasonable before now seemed incomplete. The attorney requested additional time to review everything. That alone changed the atmosphere. Minutes earlier, everyone had been moving toward a conclusion. Now the process had stopped completely. Rowan remained silent. She wasn't reading the room. She was reading the documents. Page after page. Line after line. I could almost see her perspective shifting as she connected pieces she had never been allowed to see together before. Across the table, Carter's expression grew increasingly tense. Gail avoided eye contact. Nobody knew what to say. Then something unexpected happened. The documents themselves were powerful. But they weren't what truly broke the room open. What changed everything was the reaction they created. Because once people started questioning what they thought they knew, they began remembering things. Conversations. Comments. Moments that had never made sense before. And one by one, those memories were about to turn a quiet meeting into something Vernon could no longer control. The shift didn't happen all at once. It started with silence that felt heavier than before, like the room had lost its original script and no one knew where to continue. Someone across the table cleared their throat and pointed at a specific clause in the documents. They didn't sound accusatory at first, just confused, but the confusion carried weight. Another person leaned in closer, rereading the same section, then slowly looked up as if something they had ignored for months had suddenly become important. Then it began. Not an argument. Not an explosion. Something more dangerous. Recognition. A cousin mentioned a conversation they had overheard a while ago, something they had dismissed at the time because it didn't seem relevant. Now, with the papers in front of them, the same memory took on a different shape. What had once sounded like casual advice now felt like coordination. Another relative added their experience. A small moment at a dinner, a comment that had felt slightly off but was easy to forget. They described it carefully, almost hesitantly, as if still unsure whether they should be saying it out loud. But once one person spoke, the hesitation weakened. More voices followed. Not loud. Not emotional. Just steady pieces being added to a structure that was already cracking. Vernon tried to interrupt the flow. He shifted in his seat, corrected details, attempted to redirect attention toward interpretation instead of memory. His tone remained controlled, but the control was no longer effective. People weren't listening the same way anymore. They were comparing, reevaluating, replaying past interactions through a new lens. Gail finally spoke, but her explanation sounded rehearsed, and rehearsed explanations rarely survive scrutiny in a room full of people reconsidering everything they believed. Rowan still hadn't moved much. She sat very still, eyes moving between speakers and documents, absorbing everything without reacting immediately. That silence around her felt different now. Not passive but processing. Then Carter shifted in his chair. It was subtle at first. A small adjustment, like someone trying to stay composed under pressure. But Rowan noticed. I saw the exact moment her focus changed direction. She turned toward him slowly. Not angry. Not emotional. Just searching. The room didn't interrupt. Even the people speaking fell quiet as attention shifted toward that single exchange. Rowan asked one question. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that hadn't been there before. How long has this been going on? Carter didn't answer immediately. That pause changed everything. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, but it filled every corner of the room in a way no spoken explanation could undo. In that silence, Rowan already understood more than any confession could confirm. And for the first time since the meeting began, no one tried to guide the outcome anymore. After that moment, the room never returned to what it had been. It wasn't loud. It didn't collapse in chaos. It simply stopped functioning as a controlled plan. People were no longer following a shared direction. They were reacting individually, each trying to make sense of what they now realized they had been part of. The attorney quietly closed the folder that had been open at the center of the table. No one asked him to continue. No one tried to restart the process. The idea of finalizing anything had already lost meaning. Vernon remained seated, but his posture had changed. The confidence that had carried him earlier was gone, replaced by something tighter, more restrained. He spoke a few times, attempting to reframe what had been said, but his words no longer carried influence. They landed, but they didn't stick. Gail looked around the table as if searching for support that wasn't coming. Carter didn't say much after Rowan's question. He tried once to explain, but the explanation never fully formed. Every sentence seemed to dissolve under the weight of what had already been realized. Rowan eventually stood, not abruptly, but with a kind of quiet finality that drew attention without needing to demand it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse anyone. She simply placed the pen back on the table and stepped away from the documents. That single movement marked the end of the process more clearly than any formal statement could have. The meeting didn't continue after that. People began to leave in small groups, unsure of how to exit something that had no proper conclusion. Conversations formed in corners, but they were fragmented, incomplete, full of reinterpretation rather than resolution. I stayed long enough to see the last of the paperwork gathered and removed from the table. None of it mattered anymore in the way it had been intended. Outside, the air felt different, lighter but colder in a way that comes after tension finally releases. Rowan stood a few steps away from the entrance, not speaking at first. When she finally did, her voice was steady, but distant, like she was still organizing her thoughts rather than sharing them. She didn't ask for explanations anymore. That phase was over. In the days that followed, the situation unraveled in ways no one had prepared for. Conversations that had once been controlled became fragmented accounts shared between relatives. People began admitting things they had ignored or misunderstood earlier. Not everything was clear, but enough had surfaced that denial was no longer possible. Legal discussions continued, but the focus had shifted away from outcomes and toward understanding how everything had been shaped in the first place. Rowan moved differently after that day. Slower but more certain. She stopped reacting to pressure the way she used to. Something had settled in her that no longer allowed outside voices to define her choices. What remained of the situation was no longer about influence or control. It was about rebuilding from what had been exposed, and accepting that some truths only become visible when everything else falls apart. Some truths don't explode, they quietly break everything you thought was stable. If you enjoyed this story, stay with me for more stories like this. See you in the next one.